Welcome to this retrospective slash review for Sonic the Hedgehog 4, Episode 2. And I'm going to just let this background recording play to let you see what the game looks like, to give you a little overview, and I'll just jump right on into my thoughts. Now, I will say that I did this recording while I was attempting to get the 6th Chaos Emerald. So I actually did a lot better getting red star rings, actually, which is kind of funny because that's actually one of the achievements that's a little more difficult to get, and yet I somehow knocked that one out before I knocked out the Chaos Emeralds. But I'll get into all that here in a minute. Let me just start off by saying that I feel like this game is a pretty marked improvement over Sonic 4 Episode 1 in just about every aspect. I will start off with saying that the graphics themselves are actually probably one of the least improved aspects of this game, because I feel like it's still pretty much the same art style as what you saw in Sonic 1. There's probably a little more variety compared to Episode 1, possibly. But at the end of the day, it's still fairly, pretty much the same for all intents and purposes. It does look good to me. I personally preferred the pixel art style of the Genesis games, but I guess I'm a little more forgiving, I suppose, when it comes to the art style here. So I don't actually dislike the art style here. I think it's good. It's definitely a much more modern take, like a lot of video games that you see, for a while now. I wouldn't say just nowadays. It's actually been going on for a while. And this game, of course, is not exactly new. It came out in 2012, so definitely it's been that modern style of art for quite a while now. So anyway, this, like I said, graphically is probably the least of an improvement compared to everything else in Episode 1. I think that from the musicals perspective, I do feel like the musical choices in this game were noticeably better. In fact, there were quite a few tracks that I felt were actually really good in this game. So I think they did a good job from a music perspective. I think there's still people that, don't think very highly of either episode of Sonic 4 when it comes to music, but I actually feel like this one did have some really good tunes, personally. So definitely, yeah, an improvement in the music as well. But the biggest improvement that I think we really need to talk about is the control scheme, or just the way it controls, basically. Because Sonic definitely had a very sluggish feel to him in Episode 1, and that is definitely no longer the case here in this episode of the game. So they did a marked improvement as far as control is concerned. Now, because I'm a curious person, I looked up a little bit of information in regards to this game, and it's not the same engine as what was running Episode 1. So I'm not sure if this is an engine that was used in other Sonic games, or if this is just something they made specifically for Episode 2. I didn't look into that. But the fact that it is a completely and totally new engine would definitely explain one of the biggest drawbacks to Episode 1 was the control scheme and the physics and things of that nature. And they definitely addressed that in this game, and they did a good job with it. So yeah, Sonic definitely feels much snappier to control, and that's a huge improvement. Another big thing you just got to obviously acknowledge from the word go is the fact that Tails is now, back with us again, which is great, because I definitely kind of missed having Tails around. I had him with me all through Sonic 2 and Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and so to not have Tails available it felt kind of odd, to say the least, since he had been there with so many other things that I played recently. So I'm glad they brought Tails back, but not only did they bring Tails back, but they also added a bunch of new moves that you could do with Tail. Now, obviously, the one where the two of you join together and he flies around with you, that's the most used special maneuver that you two use all the time. So definitely a very useful ability, and in a lot of places, basically a required ability. The swimming one is probably the least useful because there's not a lot of stages where you can make use of that. But in the stages where there is a lot of swimming, you do make use of that ability quite a bit. So, not exactly a bad ability, just not as useful. The rolling on the ground, to a certain extent, is probably a little bit better than the swimming ability, or it's more it's used more often. We'll go with that basically. And so from that perspective, it's probably a more useful ability, but it still doesn't equal the amount of times you're going to use the flying ability with tails, which is, quite often, and just about pretty much every level of the game for the most part. Level design in this game, I think a lot of people have criticized, at least the first episode for sure. They definitely criticized the level design of the game, and I would say that probably for the most part, the level design in this game is improved over episode 1, with one exception, which I'll get to in just a second. I feel like there is definitely a better sense of speed, especially when you go to play the levels a second time, or a subsequent time. Basically, you start to get a better feel for the level, and I feel that basically it is well designed. Now the 400-pound elephant in the room is actually 400 pounds probably wouldn't be that big of an elephant. Moving on. The elephant in the room that we'll say is basically Oil Desert Zone Act 3. And man, I really hated that level. I'm just not even going to mince words as far as that's concerned. I really hated it. The second sand trap in that level was really bad. And I will say that my initial impressions of that level were just absolutely hard. And, I think that's a fair assessment. Having said that, I do kind of have to revise my position a little bit, because when I went back to replay the game and get the Chaos Emeralds and the Red Star Rings, which I've gotten all Red Star Rings and Chaos Emeralds now, not in this video, but I do have all of them, so there's that. But what I realized when I started replaying a lot of those levels, I did, and this was the last one I went back to, obviously, because of how much I hated it. I went back to Oil Desert Zone Act 3, and I realized that I was just playing that area incorrectly. So that does partially fall on me, because I didn't realize you could fly through the barrels with tails and he could destroy them. So my initial response when I got there was I had to have split-second timing, like literally split-second. Like you couldn't even be off a fraction of a second without basically, dying. And so, yeah, my initial impressions of the level were not very positive, to say the least. So there is that aspect. But having said that, on the replay, I realized I was playing it incorrectly, and that second sand trap wasn't that difficult to get through, and I was able to get the Red Star Ring, of course, which was in the third sand trap area. So part of that does come down to me, but for an inexperienced player, which theoretically you could basically call me a fairly inexperienced player. I haven't played a huge amount of Sonic games after all. So for an inexperienced player, that act would be just super frustrating. I could only imagine how frustrating it could be for a lot of players, basically. So, like I said, for me, I don't want to blame anybody but myself, because I feel like I should have known better than I did. But that really does come down on me. There's quite a few things I learned, basically. Getting all the red star rings really wasn't that difficult. I think there was only one that I really needed to look up how to get, and it was also an oil desert zone red star ring. I think in the first act, if I'm not mistaken. It could have been in the second act. I'm just having a blank there. Other than that, I was able to get most of the red star rings without any real guides or anything for the most part, so that was not that difficult. The Chaos Emeralds, the last two, Chaos Emeralds 6 and 7, those were pretty difficult. First 5 were actually very simple. But I just literally found this out, maybe an hour ago at the absolute max, that it's fairly similar to Sonic CD when it comes to the Chaos Emeralds, or the Time Stones from Sonic CD, basically. If you retry the level, like if you know you're going to fail the level, you can hit start and retry, and instead of playing through the entire stage again, which I did quite a bit to get the 6th and 7th Chaos Emerald, you can just hit retry, and that will help you a lot more when your muscle memory as far as the Chaos Emerald stage is concerned. So that, again, does come down on me. I spent probably a good extra hour or more just trying to get those last 2 Chaos Emeralds, and it shouldn't have been that difficult. So that's my fault, for certain. But yeah, a good thing to know moving forward if you want to get the Chaos Emeralds and you're having difficulty with the stage, is keep hitting retry, and you should be able to figure it out pretty easily. But I would say these special stages were actually not that bad. They were actually pretty good, to be completely fair. I feel like this is probably, I don't know. I mean, I've only played, the Genesis games, not counting Sonic 3D Blast, and Sonic 4, so I don't know if there's a lot of special stages in some of the other Sonic games and how it compares. So I'd say from the games that I've played, this may be the best special stage in all the Sonic games I've played. Quite possibly. I feel like Sonic CD, actually, the special stages there weren't too bad either. So it's very much a toss-up, but I did do a lot better in the first 5 special stages, and it's only the last 2 that really gave me a lot of fits. So yeah, from a special stage perspective, this game is actually probably better than some of the other ones, to be completely and totally fair. It just took me a little bit of time to figure out that trick of hitting the retry button. Another big improvement over Sonic 1 that I really can't, overstate, basically, is that the bosses are much more original in this game. One of the failings of Episode 1 was that the bosses were pretty much cookie cutter, bosses from previous Sonic games, and it would basically be the exact same boss from somewhere in one of the previous Sonic games, Sonic 1 or 2, in that game, and with just a little variation on how they worked. But so from that perspective, this game, the bosses were much more original, and I think much more better done, to say the least, basically. The last boss, I did take me a couple of tries to figure it out, but overall, I wouldn't say this game was super difficult, with the exception of that one stage for my first run. But after that, really, for the most part, it's not a very difficult game, and it's actually pretty fun. There's not a lot of frustrating aspects to the game. And yeah, like I said, I am glad I went back and I played through a lot of this stuff to try and get some of the achievements. I feel like some of the achievements may be a little hard to come about, which could stink. Like doing a multiplayer mode. I don't know how many people are playing this game still that you can actually do a multiplayer score with. I don't know how I'm going to go about getting that achievement. So from that perspective, this could be a hard game to get all the achievements on, which I actually did get every one of the achievements for Sonic 1. Um, so we'll just see how difficult this one is to get the other, because I'm about halfway through with the achievements right now. So we'll see how difficult it is for me to pull off the other achievements. But for the most part, I think this is definitely a marked improvement. And, you know, even if you are a big fan of the Genesis games, I think you'll have a good time playing this game. There's enough added features to it that makes it feel new, but also familiar at the same time. And it is a good game. I genuinely feel like this is a good game. I don't think it is as good as, again, not as good as Sonic 2 or Sonic 3, but it's definitely much better than Episode 1 and probably Sonic 1 as well. Um, does you know what? I think it probably, in my opinion, would be about equal to Sonic CD. I think I'll give it about a 90% on a 100% scale. And the fact of the matter is, if you're a fan of Sonic CD, and I did like Sonic CD, it's really nice to see Metal Sonic back here again and given a little bit of treatment, good treatment. That is one thing I will say that I find an odd design choice. I feel like it was weird that you had to beat the first act of Sylvania Castle Zone for you to be able to play Episode Metal. I feel like they should have done a better job of detecting whether or not you had Episode 1 installed so that you could play Episode Metal before going into the main game. That would have just made a lot more sense. As it is, basically, I was, I did the Act 1, went back to the 4 acts of Episode Metal, and I do feel like Episode Metal itself, having that it was pretty interesting, actually. It wasn't bad. I like the attention to detail with, like, Metal Sonic, the sounds that he makes, like when you get hit or when he revs up to get moving. So I felt like the attention to detail in that aspect was actually pretty cool. And so it was just a nice addition to have that, to say the least. And I don't know, there's a lot of variety to this game, and they did a good job, a much better job than Episode 1. And I would definitely recommend it to anybody who's a fan of any Sonic game. I mean, if you don't like Sonic, you're not going to like this game at all either. But if you're a fan of the 2D Sonics, I don't think you can go wrong with this one. Um, I didn't hate Episode 1 either. I know a lot of people don't like it. I personally did not hate it. And I feel like this one is a much better game than Episode 1, which you would kind of hope for that. One of the things I will say, a lot of people say that this game, that they were expecting an Episode 3, basically, and they didn't get it. So I guess they feel like it was the story's not resolved, so people kind of don't treat this as a canon game. Speaking of canon. So I guess I don't really see that in my opinion. I mean, it ends, you beat the Death Egg Mark II. I mean, if there's any criticism I think you could levy at it, is the fact that the actual Death Egg doesn't blow up at the end. It just kind of shuts down, and that's kind of where it ends. But for the most part, I don't really think that the story itself is unresolved or anything. And yeah, like I said, it was nice having Metal Sonic back. So a recurring villain that isn't just Eggman and only Eggman. So it's nice to see a previous creation of his come back. And yeah, I definitely think this is a game worth playing. And yeah, that's about all I can say, really. So anyway, those are my thoughts on Sonic the Hedgehog 4 Episode 2. Definitely worth it. And I think it's worth your time. So anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. And I will see you all in the next one. Take care.